That's the funny thing, Gary, about our unconscious biases. They're unconscious to us. We can't see or determine them right off the bat. But when you spend a lot of time with somebody else, they can tell you what your hidden biases are because you're acting on them. You're saying things, you're making decisions based on these biases. So in my workshops, I tell people, ask somebody that cares about you. Not the person that's going to tell you what you want to hear, but they truly care about you. They want to help you grow and learn more about yourself. Ask them and say, hey, when I make really important decisions, do you think I'm biased in any way? And then just be ready. They'll tell you, they're aware of it because it comes out.
Welcome to the Free Lawyer Podcast. I'm your host, Gary Miles. The Free Lawyer Podcast is designed for the lawyer, entrepreneur, or professional who is in some way unfulfilled, stressed, or stuck, and is looking for something better. We will discuss various blocks that limit us from achieving the personal freedom that we all desire, but have not yet fully experienced. And we will give actionable steps to free yourself from them. Are you looking to achieve a new level of success? If so, this podcast is for you. Hey everybody, welcome to today's episode of The Free Lawyer. This is going to be a really powerful and really, really important episode. One of the most important, I think, because one of the topics I get so concerned in about our legal profession is the lack of civility. Lack of civility between attorneys, lack of civility in the workplace. And we're blessed to have today someone whose passion it is to bring civility to the world and who is truly an expert in civility. And I know so many of you tell me how you work in toxic places and people aren't nice and the other lawyer is rude. And if we could bring more civility into our world, it would be a better place. And Sejal Thakkar is here and she's going to help us understand that concept better and give us some tips on how we can do that. Sejal, how are you today?
I'm good, Gary. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on your show. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Sejal, for doing what you do because as I just said, I think it is so important, not only in the legal profession, but in the world today, because we seem to have lost that important concept of civility. Sejal, tell me a little bit about your journey. I know you were an employment lawyer for quite some time, and you've gone to founding a company where your goal is to create more civility. So tell me a little bit about your journey.
Thank you. Yeah. So as you mentioned, I spent a majority of my legal career practicing as an employment law attorney, specializing in defense. So I was representing all sorts of managers and supervisors, organizations, dealing primarily with cases that dealt with harassment, discrimination, retaliation, wrongful termination, those types of cases. And I saw a lot of incivility when I was doing this. And it was pretty early on in my career that I realized that, I'm not really meant to be a litigator. I'm more of a conflict resolution person. So I found myself counseling and coaching supervisors more than actually litigating the case. And so when my son was born, now he'll be 12 in July, 12 years ago, I made a huge decision to step away from the law firm job and transition to working from home so I can raise my son. And that's really where I recognized an opportunity to leverage my legal background, with the experience and the lessons that I learned in defending organizations, seeing what they were doing right, seeing what they were doing wrong, to really kind of go out on my own. So in 2017, I started my consulting firm, TrainXtra, where now I like to say I replaced the jury room with the training room, right? And I work with organizations proactively to help create better cultures.
Wow. And when you were practicing employment law and you saw that lack of civility that caused you concern, was that between your party and the other party? Was that between lawyers, or was that just prevalent throughout?
It was prevalent throughout, honestly. When I stopped practicing, I actually went back and looked at all my cases and really thought about parties I was engaging with, whether it was opposing counsel, whether it was my client, whatnot. And I just saw that civility was broken in a myriad of different ways, even in the courts, the way that the judge spoke to certain people, the ways that counsel interacted with each other, whether you were talking about supervisors, because that's who I was primarily representing, and how they were treating their subordinates, but also peer to peer. So it was prevalent and pervasive throughout.
Wow. And I know that your goal is to create sort of more accepting, more civil, more open environments. And I'm now 69 years old. I'm sure I have my own biases and prejudices, and maybe to some extent we all do. But what strategies do you recommend for folks to become aware of their own biases and learn how to manage them and hopefully even overcome them?
Yeah, I love this question. In my first TEDx talk that I did, I really spoke about this concept of unconscious bias, because we've been dealing with conscious bias for as long as we can remember, right? We have laws in place. We have trainings that organizations do to help people become aware of what happens when you're consciously biased. But when I first learned about unconscious bias and how that really impacts all the decisions that we make and impacts the ways that we interact with each other, once I learned about that, I really recognized we can't really get to my mission, which is creating a more accepting world or more inclusive world, unless people understand what unconscious bias is.
So let's begin there. What do you mean by unconscious bias?
Yeah, and again, as I was saying, this is really what I talk about in my first TEDx talk, right? And what I mean by unconscious bias is there's a lot of science and research that we've learned in the last decade, especially, that talks about how our brain, takes in all this volume of information that's constantly coming at it, and how it then engages in this pattern recognition due to the volume of information that it gets. So when you see somebody, you make this spontaneous judgment about that person, and you don't even realize it's happening unconsciously because of this volume of information that's coming at it, and it's been sorted in your brain. Now you see someone and you make this really like a blink of an eye reaction towards somebody. Again, you're not aware of it, but you make it, and underlying that assumption is some sort of prejudicial belief, right? So it's a hidden bias, and you don't even know you have it. And then you're saying and doing things without being aware of that. And so the science has come a long way. We know there's tools that can help you identify what those biases are.
Unconscious bias like that seems to me to be particularly, I don't know, dangerous is the right, but particularly difficult. If I have a conscious bias, then maybe I could say, oh, I shouldn't feel that way. That's not the right way to feel. That's not fair. I got to work on that. But in unconscious bias, I don't even know I'm acting that way. I think I'm acting perfectly fine, but yet I'm not.
That's right.
How can we identify those first off, and then learn how to overcome them?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's lots of different ways that you can learn, right? And that's the first strategy, is you can't really implement certain strategies until you're aware, right? So that self-reflection, self-awareness is really the first step. And there's tools that can help you. There's an online tool called the implicit association test. It was I don't like calling it a test, but that's what they call it. But it was by a bunch of different psychologists from Harvard, University of Washington, University of Virginia, that came together to create this tool. And you take it, it's broken out into 14 different sections. The last time I checked, there might be more now. But it really helps you identify, you answer a number of questions, you make these associations, and it helps you identify what your natural tendency is, because your unconscious biases come from what you've experienced in your life, right? What upbringing you've had, what culture you've had, what religion, what you've been exposed to, your lived experiences. So you have natural preferences. Now, unconscious biases can be positive or negative, right? A lot of people assume that when you have an unconscious bias, it's a negative thing, but it could be positive.
I actually made that assumption. So how am I wrong?
So For example, I use this all the time, right? I have a 12-year-old son. He's the center of my universe. Now, if I'm walking down the street and I see someone that reminds me of my son, naturally, I'm going to have a favorable bias towards that person. I'm going to say, oh, they remind me of my son, and I might feel more positively towards them versus someone who, let's say, bullied me when I was a child. Right. So when I grew up in a predominantly Italian neighborhood where I was bullied. Now, let's say, and there was, like I said, predominantly Italian folks there. So to this day, when I meet an Italian person, my hands get all sweaty, my heart starts to race because of something that happened to me when I was a child. Right. Now, I'm aware of that negative bias. So I know better than to react or respond to that bias. I can check that bias and say, Sejal, this person has nothing to do with what you went through as a child, right? So being aware, taking that implicit association test, for example, another tool that you can use to help you learn what your biases are is, that's the funny thing, Gary, about our unconscious biases. They're unconscious to us. We can't see or determine them right off the bat. But when you spend a lot of time with somebody else, they can tell you what your hidden biases are because you're acting on them. You're saying things, you're making decisions based on these biases. So in my workshops, I tell people, ask somebody that cares about you. You know, not the person that's going to tell you what you want to hear, but they truly care about you. They want to help you grow and learn more about yourself. Ask them and say, hey, you know, when I make really important decisions, do you think I'm biased in any way? And then just be ready. They'll tell you, you know, they're aware of it because it comes out. And so again, the first step is to learn what they are. And then also spend some time on reflecting, you know, examining your social circle, the people you spend time with, and paying attention to the demographics of the people you're spending time with. You know, do they all look like you? Do they all talk like you? Do they all have the same beliefs? Right? That's examples of bias, and think about how you can expand the demographics of what you can do. So a lot of this is about self-reflection, Gary, and then also educating yourself, right? Educating yourself on what unconscious bias is, and then learning that there's over 200 different kinds of cognitive biases that have been identified.
Wow.
Right?
I think the two traits that seem to me to be really important are self-awareness and
Yes,
open-mindedness.
that's right.
And a desire to improve.
Exactly.
I mean, I know from trying cases in court that certain jury groups, certain judges, they all come to court with their own blend of experiences that you could label as a bias or prejudice or not, but they have experiences that shape how they respond to circumstances. And so often, particularly we lawyers, are so busy we don't really examine ourselves. We don't examine our strengths and our weaknesses, examine our thought beliefs. And I think that can sometimes carry over into the workplace. Let's talk about the workplace a little bit. How does bias come into play in a workplace, whether it's a law firm or some other workplace? How does it impact on the culture?
Yeah, no, it impacts the culture in huge ways. Because again, especially your unconscious bias, you're not aware of it, but it affects the way that you perceive and the way that you interact with other people, right? Culture is really collective, what the people are behaving and how they're acting in a workplace, right? So collectively, a lot of times these biases are then ingrained systemically into your organization, into your policies, into your procedures. And so we know that when creatures, you know, we're used to doing things the same way. We're creatures of habit. And so when you're looking at making systemic changes, this is one of the areas that I, you know, face a lot of resistance, especially when you're working with legal firms and lawyers and law practices, is we need to look at these systemic practices and policies and start there about how do we create more inclusive processes, practices to give people more access, right? And so it shows up in systemically, but then also it shows up in the way that people treat each other, right? So if somebody, let's say of a marginalized group, can't expect basic civility in their interactions with one another, that's where you start seeing stereotypes popping up, fear, right? And these unconscious biases then turn into toxic work environments, right? So especially in law firms, I wrote down this resource that I wanted to share with your listeners because you talk about unconscious bias in law firms. And, you know, obviously when you're dealing with stress and burnout, then you see a lot of biases rearing its head. But there was this report that came out. It is called, you could just type this into Google. It's called "You Can't Change What You Can't See." And it was conducted by the Center of Work-Life Law in the University of California, Hastings College of Law, in conjunction with the Minority Corporate Counsel Association and the American Bar Association. And this report really was an eye-opener for me, Gary, because it shows about all the implicit gender and racial biases in the legal workplaces. And it also offers solutions and tools for how we can interrupt that bias. So going to your earlier question of strategies, this report really has a lot of tools to help you address those systemic biases that might be present in your law firm or your organization.
The one thing that surprised me of what you said is I could see if I'm the leader of a group, a firm, and I have some unconscious bias against some group or category, that could affect the communication of the firm, the atmosphere. But I guess I'm surprised there are sort of policies or processes in the firm that are reflective of unconscious bias. What kinds of things might they be without being specific to a certain workplace?
Well, I mean, even just your basic equal employment opportunity policy in it of itself, it identifies certain protected characteristics that are protected by law. But unconscious bias is about any characteristic, not just those protected characteristics, right? So for example, some of the cases I dealt with, right, where they weren't actionable or they weren't illegal per se, but we certainly don't want these type of stereotypes and biases in our organization. So for example, weight. Right? I had several cases where somebody was being bullied because of their weight or their height or because they were bald, right? These are not protected categories.
Right.
Yet this is the policy that almost every organization has in place. So if we truly want to create an inclusive environment, we need to make our policies more broader to include and really make it around civility and inclusion rather than those protected categories, which tend to be more divisive than anything else that I've seen.
You know, we touched on law firms, and I talked to a lot of people in LinkedIn, a lot of lawyers, and I've heard some terrible examples of what they call, in which I agree, are toxic workplaces. And law firms are often places where civility can be a challenge. And there are some good reasons for that. Folks are under a lot of pressure. They have time deadlines, they have demanding clients, other attorneys. I get that. But having said that, what can we do to change the culture in law firms? And I can't judge that they're worse than other places, but I can judge that I think they're not good enough. What can we do to make our legal workplaces more civil and less toxic?
Yeah. So, this is a basic, regardless of whether it's a law firm or not, right? You need the leadership buy-in. That's essential. That's the first step. Leaders have to be committed to having a civil work environment. So I'm out there advocating, Gary, for every organization to implement what I call civility action plan, right? So you get your leadership commitment, part of your civility action plan, which is a comprehensive sort of roadmap of first of all, you want to define what is civility, because civility means something different to a lot of different folks, right? So as an organization, just like you would with any other core value that you might have. A lot of organizations have respect, whatever your core value is, you go through the same process with civility. Everybody has to understand what the definition is. And you want to set clear expectations on what those civility guidelines are. Give people rails. So this behavior is acceptable in our organization. This behavior is not. So people understand what is expected from them in terms of how you've defined civility as a core value. And then obviously you want to promote education and training. That's top to bottom. It's not going to just work. This isn't just the leadership thing. Leadership sets the tone and they're the role models, right? But everybody in the organization has to understand what civility is, and more importantly, know what to do when they witness it or they're on the recipient, they're the victim of incivility. And incivility could be a lot of different things, like rude, unwelcome behavior, microaggressions, your abusive conduct, bullying. So it's way more than just your illegal behaviors. And so you want to really help people understand that a lot of these behaviors can be addressed one-on-one, and they can be dealt with by the parties involved, if we give them the proper tools and the scripts in order to do that.
So
Now, there's certain
you're saying
behaviors.
if there's someone who, well, we'll use the term bully, it's inclusive enough that gives us the concept. A bully and the victim, the two of them together can talk and work that out. That would seem not possible to me.
So what I'm saying is that if we address the behavior early, right when it starts to happen, so somebody makes, for example, an inappropriate comment, or let's say, this is the example I use in my workshops. You have a manager that yells at their employees because they want to try to get them to do their job, right? So the manager has good intentions, is trying to motivate these employees, but uses a bad technique, inappropriate behavior of yelling. So what we want to do, and what I encourage, is that we want to interrupt that behavior or disrupt that behavior right when it starts to happen. So either those two employees or somebody that witnesses that behavior needs to address it in the right way, in a respectful, in a civil way when it happens. So now the manager is aware of that inappropriate behavior that doesn't line up with the core values. And now that manager is accountable for changing their behavior. If they continue to engage in that behavior, now HR needs to get involved. Now the lawyers need to get involved. Now we need to follow their disciplinary process. When it becomes abusive in conduct and bullying, we haven't done this right, because now the behavior has continued for a long period of time, because bullying is intentional, repetitive behavior. So we shouldn't, if we do this right, we shouldn't be getting to the point where these behaviors are becoming normalized.
We're interrupting the behavior earlier and then so it doesn't get to that point.
Exactly. That's the whole reason why we're doing it this way.
Gotcha. Sejal, what role do empathy and compassion play in creating a more civil, a more diverse, more inclusive workplace environment?
They play a huge role, right? And I talk about this in my first TEDx talk. In order for us to do this work of fostering inclusivity, which includes addressing these biases, right? The first step is for people to recognize and openly acknowledge their own biases. And this is going to help demonstrate that empathy, right? So if I'm a leader and I acknowledge I have a bias, which we all do, there's nothing wrong with having biases. It's only wrong when you don't do the work to understand what they are and you engage in behaviors that are harmful. But we all have them. If you have a brain, you have bias. But if I'm a leader and I acknowledge my biases openly, then it's going to help my team members feel more understood and valued and able to acknowledge their own biases and do this work, right? So again, compassion is a critical component, because this is all about understanding each other's perspectives, right? We all have different lived experiences. So in my first TEDx talk, I make this distinction of, we've all sort of heard of the golden rule, which is to, we all want to treat other people in the ways that we want to be treated. But I'm saying, no, let's be more empathetic, more compassionate. Let's follow the platinum rule, which is let's treat other people in the way that they want to be treated, right?
That makes sense. That makes sense.
And the only way we can treat somebody the way they want to be treated is we have to make the time to get to know them, to connect with them, to see life or try to understand life from their perspective, right? And then we also have to be humble. Right? We have to be humble as we do this work, because I haven't lived life through Gary's, lived experiences. And so I might say something without knowing that it's going to be harming somebody else, right? So we're going to make mistakes as we do this work, but as long as we're open to learning and willing to change, then we move towards that inclusion that I think everybody wants to feel, that sense of belonging. And that's really where all my workshops and all my trainings go to, is how do we create civility so that we can have belonging, where everyone can be their authentic selves at work, right? So
being our authentic selves, that's such a wonderful goal, because so often people walk into a law firm, they feel like they have to act in a certain way, to look a certain way, to be, if not accepted, to just be part of the team. They have to act a certain way, and that's very uncomfortable, isn't it?
It is. It absolutely is. And especially if you think about it, we've all been victims of some kinds of bias, right? We live in this society, regardless of where you live, just inherent in our societies, the way that we've been raised, we've all been a victim of bias, right? And so it really is about opening up our perspectives and seeing that, just because I see something this way doesn't mean everybody sees it the same exact way.
Right. We've talked about empathy and compassion and now humility. And I'd have to say they're not three traits that lawyers are naturally gifted towards, because we're confident, we're problem solvers, we're decisive, we're giving information, we're giving answers rather than, and I think my point in saying that is that's something we all need to focus on. I've written newsletters and talked about the importance of empathy and compassion in the past. And I think they're really wonderful traits for lawyers to strive to have.
Absolutely. I think that's what I always talk about when leaders say, what is the one skill? Right. And I just I did a poll on this exact topic just the last week. And I said, as a leader, what is the one skill that you think that, we need to see more of? And empathy is hands down on my list, because I do a lot of workshops on this topic of empathy. And when you just look at and again, when I looked at all the cases I had worked on, and I started asking myself this question of why did we end up in court on this case? It came down to two things: lack of empathy and lack of communication, or inappropriate communication, right? If we can just address those two things, I think a lot of the lawsuits that we see, Gary, wouldn't even get to that point.
Go away.
Yeah, they would.
So for someone who's listening, who's either a manager of a team or a leader of a firm, and they listen to you and they want to have a more open, civil, diverse, inclusive environment, where do they start? What steps can they take to make that happen?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to really, again, you have to have comprehensive training programs, right, that address this, because the topic of civility isn't just one thing, right? It's a lot of different topics. So, for example, unconscious bias, conflict resolution, effective communication, how to have difficult conversations, how to recognize that we all have different personalities, emotional intelligence. So, education and awareness on a lot of topics that really we haven't been taught about as deeply as we need to, especially in the workplace. So it starts with that education and getting the buy-in from not just the leadership, but for everybody in the organization, because you want to empower your entire organization to be part of this. Bystander intervention, Gary, I cannot stress enough, has to be a huge component of
again, please.
Bystander intervention.
What does that mean?
So that means again, this is what we see a lot happening in the legal industry when I was working on these cases, is that a lot of times people see what's going on that's causing incivility, that's causing these inappropriate behaviors. They see it happening, but they don't know how to interrupt that behavior. They don't know how to approach that situation respectfully and civilly. So you have to give people that script, and you have to give people the tools and normalize that. So this is not just a one-time, we bring Sejal in, she delivers her fabulous workshop, and then we're going to have civility in our workplace. This is an ongoing conversation, right? So
it's not an event that's done and concluded.
That's
like
right.
Winning the case and the jury verdict's final. It's a process.
That's right. And we have a lot of access to data, right? So you want to rely on the data from the comprehensive training program. You want to get feedback, right? You want to have this culture of open dialogue so that employees feel comfortable in sharing their concerns, because that's the second part of this. Is a lot of times people see what's going on that's inappropriate for the workplace, and then they don't know what to do. But a lot of times the second part of that is they're afraid to do something or to say something because they fear retaliation, for example, right? And retaliation is still the #1 filed complaint across the United States. People are afraid to say something because they're scared that something's going to happen to them. Some adverse action now is going to be taken against them. So you have to create this culture of open dialogue, right? Where people feel comfortable speaking up, right? And then you have to establish channels, multiple channels and ways for people to report these behaviors, right? You also want to have anonymous, what I'm seeing, you want to have anonymous channels right? So that people can anonymously report things. And you also want to have channels where it's not always going to lead to some sort of discipline. Because a lot of times when I see somebody making an inappropriate joke, it's not that I want to get that person fired. I just want them to stop making that joke, right? So what we see organizations doing is they're taking too much of a legalistic approach rather than let's do a problem solving approach. Okay, we don't want this inappropriate joke because it's divisive, not necessarily because it's going to turn into a lawsuit, right? So don't worry so much about claim defense and claim litigation and protecting ourselves when that happens, but how do we solve the problem now so that it doesn't continue to happen and turn into something illegal later?
That makes so much sense to look at it. How do we solve a problem? Because sometimes people can posture and be defensive. You should have felt that way. I didn't mean it, because they don't want it to be a legal thing. Instead of like,
Yes.
I heard what you said. Now, how can I handle that differently so you don't feel that way in the future?
Yes, that's it. So we want to interrupt and empower people to speak up in the right way when it starts to happen, so we mitigate the risk of it happening at all.
How can organization leaders champion these efforts to bring more diversity and civility into the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think really it's about transparency, right? And being transparent, and then being the role models, acting, not just saying that we care about this, but doing things to support this. There is no way around it. You have to put the money, the resources, and the time behind implementing civility as a core value in your entire organization, right? So this is something that requires, I think a lot of people say, oh, we do our anti-compliance training, that should be enough. And I'm like, no, that is not enough. You need to do a lot more than that. And then again, accountability and measurement, right? So I suggest to organizations, you know what? Make it a performance measure for your leadership teams. Make it part of what they're going to be measured on, their performance. Are they committed to civility? Are they walking civility? And if they're not, then they're not going to get the certain, monetary gains or whatever they're basing their performance on. So by making this an accountability measure, you're sending a pretty loud a message to everybody else in the organization that this is something that we value and that we're behind, right? We have a lot of work to do, Gary, we really do. But there are small steps that we can take to really make a huge difference, right? So start with getting that leadership commitment and start doing the training.
We do have a long way to go, but the key is, well, the first step is we're talking about this topic.
Yes.
I talk a lot about wellness. I've been in recovery for quite a long time, and I've seen changes with wellness in the legal profession, where it used to be stigmatized to be struggling with something, and now it's not. Now we're talking about it, but we have a lot further to go in terms of action. But I think it's that way with civility, to even be promoting civility as a very important goal for law firms and other organizations itself is a good first step. Some of the folks listening today may be law firm leaders or leaders of some other group or organization, but some are not. Some may be associates, junior partners, whatever. What are some key takeaways or actionable steps that anyone listening to you today can do to help promote civility in their part of the world, whatever that might be, their team, their unit?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, right? As far as actionable strategies. Again, if I was going to give, let's say, 3 things that I think all leaders in all organizations, regardless of where you're located, need to start by doing, is start getting people educated on unconscious bias, right? There's a huge lack of awareness on what it is, because if you have unconscious bias and you're not aware of it, then you engage in these behaviors that are called microaggressions. And microaggressions are behaviors that are basically subtle acts of exclusion, right? And so the first step is having people understand what their unconscious biases are, for them to understand what microaggressions are, because microaggressions happen so frequently. And the harm that results in the organization because of these microaggressions really prevents us from getting to that sense of belonging that most leaders want for their organizations. The second thing is bystander intervention. Empower all of your employees with the tools and the strategies so they know what to do when they witness uncivil behavior happening in the workplace, right? So, because if I'm the one being harmed, it is not my responsibility to educate everybody else. Everybody else needs to know what to do to protect me and keep me safe, right? So that will be the second step that I think is important. And the third one is really emotional intelligence, right? We need people to understand how to manage their own emotions as well as that of other people. This becomes really important, especially when we're living in a remote world where lots of people are working behind computer screens. We're seeing cyberbullying has increased tenfold, right? And people are going online talking about the uncivil behaviors that are happening in their workplaces. So we really need to have people understand that this isn't something just that impacts one person, because just because you're hiding behind a computer screen doesn't mean there's no accountability, right? There is major accountability now, because what happens behind the closed doors of your organization now becomes public. So we really need to put the time, the resources, and money behind educating people on how to exercise emotional intelligence, because a lot of times people get reactive because they're dealing with a lot of stress. They're dealing with this work at home. There's just so much going on in the world that people they're really stressed out. And so incivility has skyrocketed. People get impatient, say things they don't mean, that they're going to regret later. So getting people the tools and helping them recognize that I'm being triggered right now, and I need to take a step back. I need to put myself on a timeout. So it starts with self-awareness, right? And so I think those are just some of the things that we need to start working on and developing, not just the leaders, because I think everybody that works in an organization impacts the culture. So these are things that everybody needs to understand.
Yeah, I think you're right. So you founded a group called TrainXtra, and briefly tell us what TrainXtra does.
Absolutely. So TrainXtra is a proactive training company. I have a number of different workshops, 8 to 10 different workshops on a lot of the topics that you and I have covered during our time together today, but all really about helping organizations create safe, positive, and inclusive workplaces, right? And I do a lot of my workshops are all live or virtual live, right? So I'd say 95% of my work is virtual, but I think it's important to do virtual live because it's a lot of interaction, Gary. It's a lot of going through scenarios, having these deep conversations, really understanding that it's really on all of us to do the work together and solve this problem of incivility as a group. And how do we move forward together without this culture of canceling or shaming or blaming? It's not about that. It's really about we're moving together because we all want to feel a sense of belonging in our workplaces. Right.
That makes so much sense. And so you give these training programs. Can you give an example, without being specific of the company, about how your training program facilitated improvement in the culture at a company?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many companies I've worked with, right? So if you want specific success stories, you can look at my website. I've got recommendations and referrals from a lot of my clients, right? But I've seen, again, training is one component, right? So I'm not standing here saying training is the only thing you need to do. There's a comprehensive, like I said, civility action plan that incorporates a lot of different things. So organizations that really make civility a core value, they prescribe it, but they also then put the money, the resources, and time behind it, often report to me that they have better recruitment, right? Better retention of their talent. People feel more productive. There's higher engagement, right? The morale, I've seen that in several of the clients that I've worked with, had some high turnovers, during the pandemic, high turnovers, the morale had tanked, they've had higher morale, higher trust, right? That psychological safety, because when you first start talking about this topic, it can make people feel uncomfortable. But as I continue to work with the organization and we start going through our workshops, it creates that trust and psychological safety, which then increases the productivity of their work. Again, less turnover, and then obviously leading to less lawsuits and complaints, right?
Sejal, what do you see of the future in this arena? Are we going to be able to pull this off and create a more civil workplace, a more civil and diverse culture?
Absolutely. I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't think we were moving in that direction. And especially since we have all these advances in technology, right? We have AI now. I think these are going to help play a significant role in shaping inclusivity of workplaces, right? And we also can use technology to help us mitigate these biases that we've talked about, we're already starting to see that already, where we've got tools now that can help you mitigate bias in your hiring and how you promote, right? So we're going to see a lot of that. And also, I just think that, look, we're going global now, right? A lot of my clients are overseas. I'm doing workshops at 4 a.m. because of time zone differences. And so as we get more global, one of the clients that I work with, a venture studio, we were born during the pandemic. So most of us haven't even met yet, but here we are creating this company, we're building this company together. And so there's going to be this global perspective. So one of our core values with this client is that we're irrationally global. So there has to be this greater emphasis on, we're going to have to understand, we're not just going to see the same kind of people. You're going to be talking with people that speak all these different languages and have different religion and have different cultural perspectives. So it's ingrained into the organization. And so as that starts to happen more and more, especially when you think about like the different generations that are working together, right? I've got some clients that have 5 different generations that are going to be working together pretty soon, right? So things are going to have to change if you want to survive, right? Let alone thrive.
I think that's true. Sejal, I call this podcast The Free Lawyer. And the reason I call it that is it's my passion to help lawyers create more freedom in their life. What does personal freedom mean to you, Sejal, for your life?
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking about that question. And I think for me, it's really about just me knowing that I have the power to make the decisions in my life, right? I have a choice, even though sometimes it doesn't feel like I do have a choice, but I do have a choice, and that I am the author of my story, of my life story. So I've got radical responsibility of what I'm doing right now. And to me, that's personal freedom, right? I'm not going to be a victim. I'm going to keep moving forward, and I'm going to do what I can, and what I can control is what I'm going to worry about.
I think choice and responsibility are 2 really important concepts you touched on there. I think so many people feel like they're stuck. They don't like where they are, but they're sort of stuck there. And then realize they have a lot of choices about what they can do and how they do it in that particular place. And responsibility, too often we deflect responsibility on other people. We blame others for what's going on, and we make ourselves a victim, but really we're responsible for our own choices. I think those are great. Sejal, you've been really amazing. I love what you do. And I think some of our listeners may want to hear more about what you do and how you help train companies. How can people best get in touch with you, Sejal?
Thank you, Gary, so much for inviting me again. People can get a hold of me on LinkedIn. I'm very active on there. I'm always posting and resources on the topics that we've talked about, because I think it's a lot about education and raising awareness. So follow me on LinkedIn. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. And then also check out my website. It's TrainXtra.com. And again, I've done a lot of podcasts, and I've put a lot of resources on there as well. And you could reach out to me there if you'd like to learn more information on the various workshops that I offer.
Thank you so very much, Sejal. I so appreciate you, who you are, what you do, and for giving us your time today, because I know your time is very valuable. And thank you to all of your listeners for joining us here today. We appreciate each and every one of you. And as always, please be well, be safe, and be free. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Free Lawyer Podcast. Wherever you are listening, if you enjoyed what I shared, please leave me a rating and review. I would appreciate hearing more about what you like best and what topics you might like me to cover in future episodes. If you are interested in experiencing a more fulfilling and a more successful life, please contact me at www.garymiles.net, where you can schedule a free discovery call with me so I can learn more about you, your challenges, and your dreams. I appreciate each and every one of you, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks to all of you for your support.